Brooklyn Nets are one of the most polarizing teams in the NBA this season. Every major sports book in Vegas has them as the second best odds to win the title behind Phoenix. Entering the year, they were the undisputed favorite. This was, of course, when James Harden was still on the roster. Harden is gone and Ben Simmons is in the building, kinda. My co-host Kyle Ledbetter is in lockstep with Vegas on this one, as he has the Brooklyn Nets as his number 4 team in his power rankings, just behind Phoenix, the Bucks, and Philly. This comes a week after New York Mayor Eric Adams lifted the city's COVID mandate to allow Kyrie Irving to finally become a full-time participant again. Mr. Ledbetter, you never removed the Nets from your rankings top 10 all season, despite a bit of a below-average record, multiple injuries, and players MIA for various reasons. Why are you so unwavering in your love of the Brooklyn Nets?
Well, possibly many reasons I could be there. No, I'm just kidding. There's one reason. It's 2 words. Kevin Durant is the only reason that I am so high on the Brooklyn Nets. Why? Because just by having Kevin Durant on your team, you are a championship contender. You expect to win a championship as long as Kevin Durant plays on your basketball team. And you know what? Those are actually reasonable expectations. We have learned over the past 10 to 20 to even 30 years, if you want to go back to the Michael Jordan era, but more specifically the last 15 to 20 years of professional basketball, is that having a generational superstar in their prime on your team means that you expect to compete for a championship every single year. And that's somehow become a reasonable expectation. We can talk about Shaq and Kobe, who are the 2 generational players at the same time on the Lakers, which leads into an era of the Spurs and Tim Duncan, who was his generation's great player, which leads into 8 consecutive years of LeBron James, which then leads into the Warriors getting the 2 best players of their generation. Now, Kevin Durant is better than Stephen Curry. Both of them are still generationally great. It's not to diminish the greatness of Stephen Curry. They're both generationally amazing.
So question. So I saw that you moved the Nets from 7 to 4. Is this strictly based around the COVID mandates in New York being lifted?
I'd say market correction. So Brooklyn kept going lower because Brooklyn kept losing games, right? So Brooklyn had that 10-game losing streak in there when Kevin Durant was hurt and they were about to trade James Harden and all of the craziness that happened there. And I think that 7 was a little harsh to Brooklyn because I think Miami was ahead of them and Philadelphia was ahead of them at some points. And
is it harsh to have the 9th ranked team in the Eastern Conference as a number 7 team in a power ranking?
As long as they have Kevin Durant, right? So I subscribe to the theory that the NBA regular season, or at least seeding in the NBA regular season,
but
is
they've
almost
had Kevin
irrelevant.
Durant.
Yeah, and Brooklyn's gotten better as a result of that. But Brooklyn also is loaded ever so slightly. They're not in jeopardy of missing the playoffs, but they are in that 8 to 9 range just because of what happened during those 2 months where they were losing every single game because Harden got traded, Kyrie was a part-time player, and Kevin Durant was out for 2 months. Their roster is built entirely on those 3 stars. And so if you take all 3 of them away for extended periods of time, of course you're going to lose if Blake Griffin is your leading scorer. And so that's the reason why they have the seed they are now. I subscribe to the theory that as long as you get into the playoffs, the NBA regular season is almost irrelevant. As long as you just get in, you're going to be okay as long as you have Kevin Durant, as long as you have Giannis Antetokounmpo. It doesn't matter what seed you have. As long as you're there, you at least have a puncher's chance. It'd be nice to have home court advantage, but relative to resting players, clearly the resting players part and making sure everyone's healthy for the playoffs supersedes whatever seed you're going to get in the playoffs.
Let me give you some sports trivia. Who is the lowest seeded NBA team to ever win a title?
I believe that is the 1995 Houston Rockets.
Ding, ding, ding. And guess what seed they were?
They were either a 5 or a 6.
A 6. So in the 75-year history of the NBA, the lowest seeded team to win an NBA title was those Houston Rockets. And I believe that was also their repeat championship. So it's not like they didn't have a track record of already winning titles. The Brooklyn Nets, again, are currently an 8th seed and can waver to being the 9th seed if they drop another game or 2 to a rest of the season schedule that is conducive to dropping a game or 2. I think you sleep on the fact that the Brooklyn Nets have not been good against other good teams. You want to know their record against winning teams this year? 19-27. Want to know their records against the top 4 seeds in the Eastern Conference? They're 1-3 against the Celtics. They're 1-3 against the Heat. They're 1-2 against Milwaukee. And they are currently, they're 3-1 against Philadelphia. We'll mark that as the aberration here. In the last game, they just balled up and came after Philly fans for sure. But that's not good. That is not a good thing in a 7-game series. If you're telling me that you're winning against good teams at a 40% clip, what's 40% of a 7-game series? 2 games? 3 games? It's not enough to move on to the next round. So I don't have faith in them in a 7-game series just based off their averages. And not even playing to their averages. They need to play above their averages to move to the next round. They can always play below. And you know the real danger is of being in this 8 seed, 9 seed territory? Even though New York has decided to move on from these draconian COVID policies, guess what? Toronto disagrees. And there's a good chance that the Brooklyn Nets end up having to go to our neighbors in the Great White North. And if that is the case, then guess what? It's going to be Kevin Durant playing solo show once again against that Raptors team, who I know we dismiss, but they're a pretty good team. They're a well-rounded basketball team.
So let's say, first and foremost, it is never ideal to be in a 1-game winner-go-home situation. They may survive. It's not ideal to play in a 1-game winner-go-home situation because it's so random. Like 1 game in the NBA can be incredibly random. Now to the point I was going to go for before that, I could throw out that like the last LeBron team was a 4 seed, or the Heat were a 5 seed when they made the finals, or the Bucks were a 3 seed last year, and all kinds of stuff like that. But what if all of those stats didn't matter? I'm not saying they don't, but what if everything, but what if it doesn't matter in this example? What if Kevin Durant is the exception that proves the rule?
So you are saying that Kevin Durant is so exceptional that he's better than players like LeBron James, that he's better than players like Michael Jordan, that he's better than players like Larry Bird, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. He is the exceptional player that is going to break an unfortunate trend.
I'm saying he's better than Fred VanVleet, and I'm saying he's better than Evan Mobley.
Well, that's fine, but is he going to be better than Jimmy Butler, Tyler Hero, and Kyle Lowry when it comes to playoff time? Is he going to be better than Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown and the number 1 ranked Boston Celtics defense? Is he going to be better than Milwaukee, last year's champion, who did beat them? And I know we talk about the 1 foot on the line thing to death, but the bottom line is they got the win, and Giannis and the team around him have only gotten better. And we'll have that debate in the MVP discussion too. But Giannis has gotten better this season. So it's not even a 1-to-1 of just comparing them to last year's Milwaukee Bucks team.
Yes. And it's not a will they, it's a they can. It's not they will, it's a they can. They can definitely single-handedly, by having Kevin Durant, beat the Miami Heat with whoever you want to put on the Miami Heat team, which is really deep, by the way. Like Miami is one of these legitimate contenders. And they can single-handedly beat Boston. And they can single-handedly, with just Kevin Durant, beat the Milwaukee Bucks, because they almost did it last year. And they would have a healthy Kyrie Irving theoretically in this playoff series. It's not a guarantee. You can tell me who's healthy and who's not healthy, and I reserve the right to change my opinions on this, but they can do it. It's not a guarantee that they will, because all of this is just probabilities and possibilities, but the Clippers cannot. The Clippers are the 8 seed in the West. The Clippers cannot. The Minnesota Timberwolves cannot. Who else is in the East?
Cannot win a championship? Is that what you're asking?
Yes. So they cannot go into Miami and beat the Miami Heat in a 7-game series.
Well, that would be very hard for them to do, considering they're in the Western Conference.
Yeah. Well, throw out an Eastern Conference example. The Knicks, the Hornets. Those teams can't, without significant injury, changing the series. Like both teams, as we think they're going to be constructed in the playoffs, the Hornets cannot go into Milwaukee and win a 7-game series against the Bucks. The Cavs cannot go into Milwaukee and win a 7-game series against the Bucks.
But you know what I will tell you the Hornets can do? They can beat the Brooklyn Nets in 1 game.
Yes, they can do that. It is highly unlikely. It would just be a catastrophically disappointing ending.
It just happened. It just happened like last week. And you know what? You talk about this Brooklyn Nets team, like they have these 2 superstars and they can just run through the East. Kyrie Irving, they've had Kyrie Irving now, part-time player, but they've had him. They're 9-13 when Kyrie Irving's in the starting lineup.
Yes, I do not disagree with you at all on that situation. A 1-game sample size is incredibly random, and Brooklyn does not want to play.
I didn't just say a 1-game sample size. I just gave you a 22-game sample size.
Oh, I mean one game in the playoffs for your season. Brooklyn can lose that. One game is random, and Brooklyn does not want to play that one game. At the same time, they don't really have a choice because of like all the things you were talking about. Ben Simmons not being there, Kyrie Irving, being a part-time player who's now going to be a full-time player while also load managing the next 2 weeks. Kevin Durant being at whatever strength he is. Those are things that in a one-game sample size can lead to them losing. Now, they really want to be the 8th seed, because if they get to be the 8th seed, that means that Brooklyn gets 2 games and they just can't lose both. They get 2 chances to win 1 game. If they're the 9 seed, they have to win back-to-back games without losing once. They have to go 2-0. If they're the 8th seed, they just have to not go 0-2. So right now they're about 1 game ahead of the Charlotte Hornets. They're 2.5 behind the Cavs. They're 1 ahead of the Charlotte Hornets. So if they get the 8th seed, I would exhale if I'm Brooklyn. You just have to beat Cleveland. You just have to beat Cleveland 1 game. And even if you mess up in some weird, Evan Mobley drops 40 points or something weird, or Kevin Durant has a really, really terrible game that we've never seen from Kevin Durant before, you at least get a second chance against Trae Young.
Completely likely, though. Completely possible. In fact, a good probability, because this Nets defense is atrocious. They are the 22nd ranked defense in the NBA. And then you look at some of the other contenders. We have 3 top 10 defenses between Boston, Philadelphia, and Miami. Last night, they gave up 34 to Cade Cunningham. They took forever to put down a 19-win or 20-win Pistons team. That is all things that as who the Brooklyn Nets are. At a certain point, you just are what you are. It's like you are what you eat. How you play in the regular season is indicative of how the Nets will perform this postseason. Spell it out with me. The Brooklyn Nets are Frauds. Frauds. And I saying it
very much disagree
right now.
Very much disagree with that. I think you could make the argument the Brooklyn Nets are the greatest 8 seed to ever enter the NBA playoffs. And that is, again, nothing to do with what happened in the regular season, only to do with the fact that they still have a healthy Kevin Durant going into the playoffs.
You are basing this entire argument on that they have a second switch. They're just going to turn on the light switch the second the playoffs start. And I don't think that they have that in them. I don't think that they're going to become twice the players that they are now, because they're already doing good things. They put up 70 points against Memphis just a couple days ago and still lost. Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant put up 70 points combined earlier this week and still lost. Is Blake Griffin going to turn on a second gear? Is Seth Curry going to turn on a second gear? Drummond? Any of these secondary pieces have to step up, because it can't just be Kevin Durant. It can't just be Kyrie Irving. And from experience, aside from one shot that has defined Kyrie Irving's whole career, is he really that much of a playoff legend? Is that really who Kyrie Irving is? I know we've had this debate. I know maybe even a personal bias here. I'm not a big Kyrie fan, but I don't have that same level of faith and conviction that he's going to be the co-pilot behind Kevin Durant, and he's just going to go from being this part-time player to now finally being a full-time participant again and elevate this team to where they aspire to be.
I think everyone wants to diminish how great Kyrie Irving is, and I'm not going to be the person, for whatever their reasons may be. There's a lot of reasons to dislike Kyrie Irving, and Celtics fans are in a compromised position because they dislike Kyrie Irving for different reasons than the rest of the world dislikes Kyrie Irving, because he personally dismantled their franchise for 2 years just by leaving and saying he was going to stay and all of that. But Kyrie Irving is a very good basketball player, and very good basketball players are something that the Toronto Raptors, Cleveland Cavaliers, and Charlotte Hornets have maybe one of. Between the 3 teams, they have maybe one very good basketball player. And that's kind of the gist of it, right? If Kyrie Irving's your best player, you can kind of look like an 8 seed in the East at times. And if he's your second best player and that best player is Kevin Durant, you can still be at the top.
I'm going to disagree with that math a little bit this season. I think this season has shown that team basketball still has its place in the NBA, because you started the season, we all started the season saying, hey, look at the Los Angeles Lakers. They have 3 really good players. They have 3 superstars. And what does that mean for their season? I don't know. What are they, 13 games under 500 at this point? Kaput.
But let's see how team basketball works for Cleveland when they face the Bucks in the first round. They are going to get smacked out of the playoffs. And by the way, that's not a bad thing. Cleveland was this year projected to be the 12th team in the Eastern Conference. That's still really good. You did a great job. That you didn't have to have the expectations of we're we're going to win a championship right now. That's really, really good.
But my thing here, Kyle, is we have enough data to not just rely on just the names. It sounds like we're relying on just the names. They have Kevin Durant. They have Kyrie Irving. They also have, again, a sub 500 record against winning team. That is all part of what the Brooklyn Nets are. And I don't think it's just suddenly going to change just because the calendar flips from April to May.
But what if that didn't matter? What if all of that didn't matter? And all that matters is...
It does matter.
But we don't know
if it didn't matter, then they wouldn't be with one of the lowest seeds of any title contender that we're throwing around loosely, title contender in the NBA.
And by the way, we're also not that far off on it. I'm not saying that I think Brooklyn's going to win the championship. I don't think Brooklyn is going to win the championship. I think that Brooklyn is still somewhere between the second and fourth best team in the Eastern Conference. That doesn't mean they're going to win a championship. It just means their seed doesn't reflect how good or bad the Brooklyn Nets actually are. And this is the interesting part about this is there are a lot of really good teams this year. And each team has their flaws to a certain extent. Milwaukee's flaws are slightly less flawed than everyone else's, but Milwaukee is like 1 and then 2, 3, 4. But it's not like Milwaukee's like exponentially ahead of everyone else. Like everyone is really good this year. I know we've done many Boston debates here on this show, but Boston is still a very good team. Do I think that they stack up against the Nets in the first round? I think Brooklyn would be favored, but if Boston beat Brooklyn, I'd be like, well, that's surprising, but probably explainable. If Miami beat Brooklyn, I'd be like, well, that would surprise me, but it would be explainable.
Here's the problem. It should not be surprising. It really shouldn't be because we have data that supports it not being a surprising thing. The Nets have played as many games as these other teams have played. And even if you take out just the 1 month hiatus of Kevin Durant, they've still been a pretty mediocre team.
Kevin Durant has gotten to this interesting place where we take a lot of his abilities for granted.
It's not even about his abilities, Kyle. It's just about the team. We're talking about the Brooklyn Nets as the team right now.
Yeah, and that's okay. And the team revolves around this one giant piece that is, just by virtue of him being on a team, automatically one of the 5 best teams in the NBA. Now, that might not be the case 2 years from now. Like Kevin Durant will age at some point. It's the same way we're watching LeBron age, the same way we're watching Steph Curry age. I was actually coming back from his Achilles injury. I kind of put Kevin Durant in the like where Kawhi Leonard box is right now, where I'm like, I just have no idea what he's going to be when he gets back. And I saw Kevin Durant average 37 points per game in a series against the Milwaukee Bucks, in which he single-handedly carried the Brooklyn Nets to 7 games and coming within a foot shoe size. And I know we mention the foot all the time with Kevin Durant, but I'd also like to bring up the fact he had a 49-point triple-double in Game 5, and he had a 50-point triple-double in that Game 7 where they went to overtime. Like, this guy is absolutely levels above the competition other than maybe 3 or 4 players in the NBA. There are 3 or 4 players that stack up to this man, and those 3 or 4 players are going to lead teams that beat him in the playoffs.
Again, Kevin Durant is good. Kevin Durant is great. Kevin Durant is phenomenal. When Kevin Durant is retired, he will probably be a top 10 player of all time. But I am focusing on the 2022 version of Kevin Durant, the 2022 version of the Brooklyn Nets. And what I've seen from them to this point tells me that they are not one of the top 5 teams in the NBA. They might not even be one of the top 5 teams in the Eastern Conference. I'll use the caveat might, but here today, if I'm making my playoff picks and I'm telling you who's going to go to the championship, what I won't tell you is going to be the winner, but what I will tell you is it won't be the Brooklyn Nets. The Brooklyn Nets, I will say, will go no further than the second round in the Eastern Conference.
Spicy, bold, no mercy. Cajones pick of the week.
I will say that might be a semantics argument because they're going to have to play
semantics. Second round of the NBA Eastern Conference.
Well, so here's the part that I'd argue. So, like, let's say the Bucks and the 76ers are the 1 and 2 seed. We don't know what the 1 and 2 seed is going to be, but let's say that they're the 1 and 2 seed, and Brooklyn is the, I don't know, let's say 7 seed. Let's say they end up in the 7 seed just for shits and gigs. the one seed, say one seed is Milwaukee. Well, Milwaukee's going to get to play, say, Atlanta in the first round. Well, that's a cakewalk of a series for Milwaukee. Milwaukee's going to win that in either 4 or 5 games. Philadelphia would have to play Brooklyn in the first round, and that's a really difficult matchup because Brooklyn might be favored against the Philadelphia 76ers going into that series.
And I will give you, of course, that I mentioned it earlier, but Brooklyn does have a 3-1 record against Philadelphia. Styles do make fights, and that might be one of the fights in which the Nets might have a puncher's chance, as you referred to earlier.
Well, yeah. And I think we could flip that around too. So like say Milwaukee's the 2 seed and Brooklyn's the 7 seed. That should be in the conference finals. Like those Kevin Durant versus Giannis is like a conference finals level matchup. So yeah, Brooklyn might lose in the first round, but that's just because they had to play who they played in the first round. And I don't think that they should be criticized for just playing who they play. That's how the matchups worked out for them.
I'm just saying, if you're one of those teams up top, if you're one of the top teams in the Eastern Conference, I don't think that you necessarily have to gear your postseason or gear your final 8 regular season games with the idea of, oh, we got to avoid the Nets. I think that they are a beatable team. I don't think I would worry about them. And if I'm a good team, track record shows that I have a good chance of beating them. I have a better than 500 chance of beating them. I just need to play to my abilities. That's going to be the big question, of course, to all these teams. Can you just play to your abilities? I'm not even asking you to play to the best versions of yourself. Just play to your abilities, because Boston has an outstanding defense. Miami runs guys off the bench and are one of the deeper lineups. And Milwaukee has perhaps the greatest player in the NBA currently.
Yes. And that's why I would put Milwaukee definitely over Brooklyn, because Brooklyn does have their flaws. Like, let's not pretend Brooklyn doesn't have flaws with their team. Their flaws are more pronounced than the Milwaukee Bucks flaws, which are, well, I mean, Drew Holiday might miss some 3-pointers. That's not as terrible as they don't play defense. Like, that's more of a flaw, but Brooklyn can overcompensate for that. Brooklyn can overcompensate for not being able to play defense with Kevin Durant.
You can do it against bad teams. I don't think you could do it consistently against good teams.
It's interesting, right? This is why we play the series, because you're in this weird place where in a 7-game series, you can design yourself specifically for a matchup and make adjustments. And that might mean your defense plays a little bit better because you've seen the same opponent over and over and over again, and you can create a different game plan around it. You cannot game plan Kevin Durant because Kevin Durant is 7'1" and maybe the greatest shooter in the history of the NBA. You can hand in his face as much as you'd like. That man, not shooter, scorer, but also really good shooter. But still, Kevin Durant is one of the
part
best.
Of the Splash Bros, but he's not. Step
He's a scorer. I should have said scorer more than shooter. One of the greatest offensive player of my lifetime. We'll call it that. But he's the greatest offensive player of my life. Milwaukee is much better constructed than Brooklyn. Philadelphia is as well constructed as Brooklyn. Miami and Boston, I think, would probably fall to Brooklyn in a series like we talked about earlier, and it's really difficult. Those 2 teams are also pretty good. Yeah, so I mean, I'm thinking back to the other power rankings, and like the Nets are 4, and then Miami is like 7, and Boston is 8, and that's kind of it. Like they're behind Brooklyn. It looks like they're a tier behind Brooklyn, but at the same time, Brooklyn could be either one of those options, right? Like their team's so predicated on Kevin Durant that if Kevin Durant does play poorly, which again, never happens. Kevin Durant never, ever plays has a terrible LeBron 17-point game in a playoff series.
I'm sure we could find one. If we really wanted to do the research here, we could find one game log that you're like, that's kind of gross.
But he's played 80 playoff games over the last 4 seasons, and you'd struggle to find 1 or 2 where he's not scoring 25 points per game. You can find them somewhere in the archives, but it rarely ever happens for Kevin Durant. And that is the point that if you're banking on the 3% chance that Kevin Durant has an awful game multiple times in a series, then yes, that changes Brooklyn. Brooklyn is incredibly Kevin Durant centric, and I would argue you should make that bet. Not with the value that you're getting right now. They're not the favorites to win the Eastern Conference. Vegas just wants you to bet Brooklyn. That's why they're juicing the value so much on Brooklyn. They want you to bet because they know Brooklyn is not going to win the Eastern Conference. And I'd say your bet is that he can get you to the top 4. He can get you to the top 4 just by virtue of being on that team.
Kyle Ledbetter here today, staring into the camera, locking eyes. Do you bet me $10 that the Brooklyn Nets will make the Eastern Conference Finals?
Yes, if you can guarantee me that they won't play Milwaukee in the first 2 rounds. If you can guarantee me they won't face Milwaukee in the first 2 rounds, then I would take that bet. I'd be nervous about the 76ers. As long as Milwaukee and Brooklyn don't face until the conference finals, then I would say, yes, I will take the bet. But if Milwaukee and Brooklyn meet in the first or second round, then I will say that's just semantics. But what I would be essentially betting $10 on is, will Brooklyn beat Philadelphia in a playoff series? And oh, man, I don't know. I do not know if Brooklyn can beat Philadelphia in a playoff series.